Today our guest is Friedhelm Radandt.
Even if you go through those difficulties, he is there. And he gives you the strength to ultimately do the right thing.
Share the gospel clear and strong. Stand for, claim your heritage of truth.
Welcome to Heritage of Truth. Today our guest is Friedhelm Radandt. Did I say it pretty well?
You said it very well. Thank you.
Well, he is the author of a book called The Radio Signal, the true story of a harrowing escape and a love that arose from a world war. This is intriguing. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I can't wait to read it. Tell us what this story is about and what your involvement is.
Let me say first how the title came about.
Okay.
It's interesting. It happened at the Yad Vashem Museum, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
As a family, we were there, and my grandchildren were all next to me. And when we came into the Warsaw Ghetto exhibit where my wife, when she was a young girl, she saw SS mistreat Jewish children, and she never forgot it. And suddenly, in that space, I saw a radio. And it had a German word, Volksempfänger, meaning people's radio, like Volkswagen, VW.
Right.
Volksempfänger. And I had to explain to them that that was the radio I listened to, because Hitler, almost a few weeks after he became chancellor, promoted that radio. It was a simple radio. It worked on one radio tube. And of course, it had all the propaganda, and he thereby quadrupled the number of households in Germany that had a radio.
Oh.
And he had a great influence, and World War II became the first war in which people most frequently got their news first on the radio.
Oh.
While I was translating all the signs in the ghetto for my grandchildren, I had to tell them, that's the radio. And then I said, now you also have to know that your great-grandfather, my wife's father, developed those radio tubes because he was a physicist working for Philips in Warsaw, Poland. So they saw this connection. And the story was just there because both families very connected to radio. The radio sometimes gave the sign where to go next as the Russians were approaching. But here we were two families, one in Poland, a German family, but the family had lived there for 200 years.
Wow.
They were believers in the Lord Jesus. They attended a German-speaking Baptist church in Warsaw, and they lived through this time. The first few years of the Nazi regime, there was nothing, because the Nazis weren't in Poland, not until 1939 when Hitler invaded. And 100 miles northwest, my parents lived. And I was 12 and a half at the end of the war.
And was this in Germany or in
In
Poland?
Germany.
In Germany.
This was across the border in Germany. And we, of course, experienced. So this whole story of how these two families dealt with Nazis and then went through the war, becoming refugees, how Christians responded to Hitler's ideology. That's really much of the subject of this book.
Wow. And I noticed that it was endorsed by Eric Metaxas.
Right.
That's quite an endorsement.
Thank you.
That's quite an endorsement.
Thank you.
So that was one of the reasons I wanted to interview. I thought if Eric Metaxas was that impressed with this book, then it must be an amazing book. So
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about what happened.
Well, what happened is that very early on, my dad actually was a Christian, clearly a believer. But because of the high inflation rate that had going on and the bad economic situation, had really sort of become maybe not much of a Nazi, but went along with it. And he even joined the program which Hitler had started, Strength Through Joy. And he worked for them and did well. And then they asked him to fill out the questionnaire to prove his Aryan purity. So he could get a promotion and have a good job. And it's at that time, at that point, that he simply said, I can't do that. And it's detailed in the story how he came to the conclusion that what Hitler said and what the Bible said were not compatible. And he had to take a stand. Then, of course, lost his job and was persecuted for that, found another job in another city and lost it again. And it's the story, one of the things that's not much known, voluntarily joined the army. Now, there was a real battle between the army and the party.
Oh, really?
Yes. By joining the party, the army, he escaped the pressure of the Nazis. And he told me personally that in his office, which was a recruitment office of all places, they never said Heil Hitler. So he lived with that. And in our home, we had every Sunday afternoon a church meeting. We were a Baptist family, and there wasn't really a Baptist church in that town, but we had these meetings every Sunday afternoon. And it became a deep commitment to Christ. At the same time, my wife's Elizabeth's family in Poland went through the fact that her dad had to deal with the fact that the Polish resistance put him on the death list.
Oh, my.
I mean, he was producing radio tubes for the Navy. So this was, if you had been a Polish resistance fighter, you would say, we may like you, but we can't tolerate that. And they liked him because he was Polish friendly. They had close friends, but suddenly with Hitler's invasion, they were now marked to be Germans.
Oh, I see.
Had been Polish citizens. In fact, my wife's uncle, her mother's brother, was an officer in the Polish army when the Germans invaded. So you see two German families, very different experiences, and yet in a sense the same.
Wow.
But they liked her father, and so they told him, they met him privately and told him, if you get out of here, you're safe. So working for Philips moved him to Germany. The family stayed behind, but he worked in an underground lab to continue his work.
Wow.
So these were the kinds of things. And then, of course, come the whole war experience.
Yeah.
My brother, who was only 2 years older than I am, at 14 was drafted in the army.
14?
At 14, and given a motorcycle. He didn't even have a driver's license, but a motorcycle which he drove and experienced taking secret orders to the front lines. And as the Russians were coming closer and closer, these families became refugees, escaping, and it was very, very difficult. I think one of the most difficult and touching stories in here is about my mother, we fled the town. Actually, the orders were not to leave, and nobody was supposed to leave. But the unit of which my brother was a member, his commandant sent him home in a car to pick us up, put us on a bus, to take us out of town. A bus which, by the way, left me behind. But anyway.
Oh, my.
And it was very touching how my mother then wanted my brother to leave the army and saying, this is over, we have to go on with our lives. And he, at 14, said, oh, I can't desert. So he stayed behind and told about my sister, who was also separated from the family. She spent her year as the obligatory year of service, household service. on an estate where she served as a nanny, had a good time, but then suddenly the Russians came while they were having lunch. The Russians came in and they had to run out the back door without clothing in the middle of the winter and across the lake. So all these stories are in there, the escape stories.
Oh my goodness.
But it goes on how then these two families actually we then met in Hamburg afterwards, and they became intertwined.
Well, it sounds like a really interesting book. Well, what do you see as the significance of this story of faith for the understanding of Christians in Germany during Nazi era?
Well, I think that's a deep question. For me, in a subtle way, I want to project that these people, and my grandfather, who plays a major role in that story, my dad understood, God is Lord of history. Even if you go through those difficulties, He is there. And He gives you the strength, ultimately do the right thing, the responsible thing. And if that message, I don't deal with that philosophically, I deal with it in a practical way. But when my dad came back from the war, ultimately, he said to me, look, God was at his most gracious when He allowed Germany to lose the war. You know, to see God's grace active in defeat. That's a very important aspect. If we can see that and learn that that's not the end. God has a plan.
That's right. That's right. So does your family live in the United States now?
No.
So are you from Germany?
We two are the only two who immigrated.
Oh, okay. So you live in the United States.
We live in the United States. Oh, yes.
Yes.
No. We live in the United States.
But the rest of your family is still in Germany?
All our brothers and sisters, parents, all, they never came here. So to visit, yes, but not to live here.
And I can see some differences already in this book, but there are a lot of World War II books out. This seems to be the first that I've heard of that's from a German perspective. Is that correct?
That's very important, what you're asking. You know, it was difficult for a long time to write about these things. And you mentioned Eric Metaxas, he wrote the Bonhoeffer book.
Right.
And it's amazing, that book was written in America. Really dealing with Bonhoeffer and claiming him for what he truly was, a fellow believer who stood up for what was biblically true. An amazing story. Germans had a tough time talking about these issues.
I'm sure.
Even after the war. For a long time. I mean, they never knew how would others respond. So yes, it took all these years, and now in my retirement, as I did a family history for our grandchildren, so they would know where they come from, where their grandparents and great-great-grandparents came from. And I had put that all together, and my son said, you've got to write this. This era of the Nazi era, and make it known. Yes, I think you're right. It is a book from the German perspective. The whole liberation.
And German believers.
German believers, yes. How they were there. You know, prayer warriors. Yeah, very, very important to see that.
Yeah. Does the image of the grandfather in the story go beyond the real, and I don't know how to say the name. Is it August? August.
Yeah.
Ratunde?
Ratunde. August Ratunde is my grandfather, my mother's father. He plays a big role because he played an important role to me. And I knew that when my son said, you've got to write this book, and he said, you've got to write about your grandfather, whom you liked. So he had picked up on that. But my grandfather became a Christian in World War I, in France. And it was a total submission to God. His life changed dramatically. And from then on, his decisions were disciplined, biblically founded. He was giving us advice. He was there when we needed him. and just amazing. And I paint him in this picture, but this is who he was. To me, this is not exaggerated. He talked about his faith after the war, when I asked him many questions. During the war, we came to his house when we first fled from the Russians. He got us out of the town. We were totally surrounded. This was a seaport on the Baltic Sea, and all around the Russians. So the only way out for us was by boat.
Wow.
And we went together. He took us there. At that point, he had to bury his wife, who had died when the Russians came down, and the bullets strafed the courtyard and the window, and I had been in that shooting from the airplanes, the Russian airplanes, just in front of the railroad station there. And we had to bury her. He handled that with grace. And you really had to look up to him. He was a guy who just loved people and wanted them to know Christ. But he made tough political decisions when necessary.
Wow.
So he played a very major role in my upbringing and in my convictions.
That's good. I would like to talk to you all day about this book, and I can't wait to read it. But where can people find out more about the book online and about you?
Well, the book has just come out, and
Okay.
I have to say I'm thankful for those endorsements you mentioned. One of them, there are others too. And I'm very thankful. It's on Amazon, of course, but it's a Deep River Books publication in bookstores.
Okay.
People are asking for it, and so I'm very, very pleased
Yeah.
as people read it. And it's a book, I should add, not just for Christians. It's for the whole family, young and old. But
Well, I think
also
it's important for people, the young people, to understand the
Very
history.
important.
Yes.
very important. This is teaching them about an era that we must not forget, because so many issues are the same issues today.
That's right.
And so it's also a book for non-Christians. The title is open to anyone. And so I can see they feel, they've told me, they can't put it down.
Good.
So I'm glad for that.
Well, thank you again so much, Friedhelm,
Friedhelm, yes.
for being my guest.
Thank you.
Share the gospel.